A lot has been happening lately. Comfortable and uncomfortable things. Some of these happenings just leave me curious and confused as to why all of this is happening. I've been experiencing things to the point where I've broken down, and I shall tell you how and why right now. One day, I was sitting in front of the door to my brother's room, just casually sitting there, listening to music as I waited on my brother to come back. When he finally came, just as I turned my head towards him to say something, I was kept completely shut and frightened over what I had just seen. I let out a small scream, which left my brother worried and motivated him to ask me why I had let out a sudden reaction. I explained it all to him, about how I saw a solid figure of a man that stood right behind him. Now, I really didn't believe in the paranormal, and to see something like this just shook me. I did, and still do believe that spirits are real, but my view on seeing them had totally changed around after this incident. I am religious, and I pray more often than I used to back then, which has helped me a lot because I feel more protected and safe. But it doesn't end there. When I found out that my brother was experiencing the same things as me, we told our mother and she sat us down to explain it all. We found out that she had similar things happening to her in the past too, and I had also learned that when my mother was trying to get pregnant with her first child, me, that she was targeted by black magic and had been attacked by a shadow person. That gives me a feeling that something or someone, the spirits, may have gotten through some closed doors. I'm not a professional or anything, but it's something I assume may have happened. Anyway, we've had our house checked out by different mediums, and they all said the same things. They told us that something was in this house. But the thing is that I feel like there's more than one spirit in this house. One I sense as good and the other I sense as bad, but not demonically bad. I can feel it in my gut. Most times, out of nowhere, I will occasionally see a black mist pass by the corner of my eyes, but I end up dismissing them as my imagination. The way these spirits contact me are through my dreams, most of the times, rather than in my awake hours, although I've seen the solid figure of a man twice in the same hallway I had an encounter with the first solid figure that appeared behind my brother. At night, I feel cold touches, especially on the side of my head, and the feelings of pins and needles stuck into my hands. Very recently, it was as if I was completely drained of my energy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think straight. Hours later, I was totally fine and slept well, but this isn't the only time that something like that has happened. One night, I was sleeping and I felt this voice speak into my ear. It was vividly clear enough to make me understand the words being said, and the voice was soft, yet in a little harsh tone. It said something like, "You think you're clever, don't you? I'm stronger than you, girl. Try me." That's when I woke up. My heart was racing so fast to examine if one of my siblings played a harmless yet frightening prank on me. But when I realized there was no way for my siblings to do that to me, I froze in shock. My bed was against a wall then, and since my door is a bit broken and the floorboards haven't been fitted back in properly, if you open the door, it would create a loud sound that would make anyone jolt. I'm a light sleeper, by the way, so there was no way that anyone could have pulled it off. Plus, I don't sleep against the wall. I always sleep away from the wall, so I wouldn't have known and felt something get onto my bed and lay beside me. It's just confusing me, all of this. I found myself crying one day because of it. I don't know what to do. I've decided to keep myself devoted to God and to follow the light, as I know that's the only thing that assures me safety. I'm sorry for posting such a long story, but I would like to know your opinions and advice on what I should do or about what's happening to me. Thanks. Number 2. My name is April. I'm 21 and have a story to tell you about the experience I had with the infamous Ouija board. You have heard stories of Zozo the demon, right? Well, he is real, and I have read stories on him, but didn't actually think it was true until it happened to me. 3 months ago, I had moved in with my sister, and I had brought a couple friends over to hang out that evening. We were all smoking a cigarette when I came up with the brilliant idea to play the Ouija board and ask otherworldly spirits questions about the afterlife and questions about the future. Now, I have played the board by myself for many years with little to no negative spirits speaking with me, but this evening was in fact different. We sat at the table and put our hands on the cursor and moved it clockwise around the board as we said Ouija out loud 3 times. My friends weren't avid believers in the paranormal or using the board from rumors they had heard. I asked, "Is there anyone there?" The cursor moved slowly to yes. "Who are we speaking with?" The cursor repeatedly went from Z to O and continued to do so after the question was asked. "What do you want?" It quickly spelled out her. "Who is her?" I asked. It spelled out my friend's name, and I was freaked. "What do you want with her?" It spelled out, "I want her." Very quickly, the cursor returned to moving from the Z to the O yet again, and I was getting annoyed with this because it wouldn't tell me why it wanted my friend. It just spelled out, "I want her," repeatedly. My friend, the one the demon wanted, stupidly called him a pussy, and the board spelled out death. That's when things got bad. I got angry and told her not to provoke him because he was capable of bad things, and I sure as hell didn't want anything happening to my friends. The other friend just sat there freaked out, not speaking the entire time, as we continued to ask it questions, which I don't recall. The cursor began feeling hot under my fingers, and I asked my friends if they felt it too. They said they did. I asked it another question, but its answer didn't make any sense. It spelled out. The word it spelled out was mama, over and over, and would not move to any other letters, so I cussed at him because I was getting annoyed. The one friend took his hand off the cursor and refused to play anymore, and the atmosphere immediately changed. I could feel Zozo in the room now, and the air was heavy, and I began to get scared. All of a sudden, I didn't feel like myself. I felt if something was inside me. I felt the most intense hatred I've ever felt before. I began to laugh hysterically and then cry like I had no control over my emotions. My mood then turned to hatred again, and I turned to look at my friend, the one the demon wanted, with the most evil smile. I felt it inside. It wasn't me smiling. It was the demon. We all stopped playing the board after that, but the heavy feeling in the air and its presence remained. It took a bit before everything felt normal again that night, and I felt like myself, but when it did, I was certainly relieved. I feared for my friends' safety that night, but fortunately, none of them experienced anything after leaving. My advice? Do not mess with the Ouija board. Evil presence in the flat. Since moving out of the flat, when I was going through my divorce, I've made a point of not going back in there unless it was really necessary. When we had tenants renting the place, I had no need really, but the tenants left and my mom decided to move in there. Suddenly, I had to go there quite often. The atmosphere in the place was always thick to me. It was like the air was harder to breathe. On one specific night in April 2015, my mom sent me a message and told me strange things were going on in the flat. Not one to leave my mom alone when she was far less open than I was, I ran to the flat. She was sitting in the lounge when I came in, and she asked me to step into her room and tell me if I smelled anything. As I took the one step into her room and came to the closet, on my left, bed to my right, there was the very distinct smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. I walked towards the bed, and the smell decreased, towards the closet, and the smell was stronger. No one in the yard smokes, so the chances that it could have been carried in from outside are zero. The closet is also not close to any windows, so the fact that the smoke was centralized to that spot was enough to get my hair standing on end. I went back to my mom and asked her if this was all she had been experiencing. She said no. The whole week, she could feel someone take hold of her ankles as she lay in bed, until one night, where not only did something take hold of her legs, it pulled her halfway out until she got panicked and started kicking. By then, her legs were completely off of the bed. She swore to me for a second it felt like she had kicked a solid human being, but no one was there to be seen, although she clearly smelled the smoke. The weekend, I had Tim and Eileen over and explained the story to them. Tim went into the flat alone, leaving us by the pool, and after about 5 minutes, he came out. He said that the person in the flat was a man, middle-aged. He gave features to this man that had my mom and I looking at each other. For my South African compatriots, the man looked like a thinner version of Eugene Terror Blanche. I asked Tim if he could see the man's right arm, and Tim told me that the man made an effort of staying in silhouette. I went into Adam's room and fetched my mom's wedding album. I found a picture of my paternal grandfather and showed it to Tim. Tim nodded. The man in the flat was my mom's father, Johnny. Johnny had lost his right arm in a car accident. Considering he had been instrumental in the abuse I suffered in the flat, not to mention that he was responsible for the death of my gran when she was 32 years old. My mom was 5 at the time. Neither my mom nor I were very happy about the fact that he was in our home. My mom told me to take every picture of him out of the album. She took the pictures, gave them to Tim, and told him to burn them. After he had destroyed every picture, Tim told us what he needed to cleanse the flat, and he went in alone. He was busy for close to 2 hours. By then, it was late afternoon. As night came around, my mom went into the flat. For some odd reason, the main switch of the electricity was off. Strange. She switched the power on and went to her bedroom. My son, T, came into the flat and told her he smelled smoke. Since they are both asthmatics, very bad timing. My mom ran out of her room and saw the box that she had set down on the stove catch fire. Yes, not the smartest move putting flammable materials on a stove. Curious though, my mom never cooks in the flat, so the stove mains are always switched off on the circuit. Yet, every plate on the stove was glowing red, turned up to full heat, and the box and its contents were on fire. Mom yelled and grabbed T, rushing to get out. Tim rushed in, grabbed the box, dropped it in the sink, and doused the flames. Outside, both my mom and my son were having full-on asthma attacks. When Eileen and I were able to get my mom and my son calmed down and breathing, we speculated as to why the stove would have been turned on when it is never used. Tim stated very simply, "You burn my pictures, I will burn you." A sick parting gift from a bad old soul.
This is a story that my mother told me and my sisters. Back in the 40s, my dad accepted a job in Atlanta, Georgia, and my parents moved from Chicago, Illinois to Atlanta. For several weeks, they stayed at the Biltmore Hotel in Atlanta while looking for a home. One night, my mother, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was alone in the room by herself because my dad was on a business trip. She said that she woke up at about 3:35 in the morning and saw a man standing beside the bed and looking at her. The man was well dressed in a suit and smiling at her, but she knew immediately it was a ghost, because although she could see him plainly, he was transparent. She could see through him. When she was growing up, the woman who had raised her told her if she ever saw a ghost, say the Lord's Prayer, and it would go away. She pulled the sheet over her head and said the Lord's Prayer, but when she looked again, he was still there. She would close her eyes and open them again, but he did not go away. She fell asleep with the sheets pulled over her head, and the next day she found out at the front desk that a man had died in that room at that exact time she saw the ghost. She described the man she saw to the clerk to ask if she knew him. She felt like the ghost meant her no harm and was there to make himself known and protect her. Her and her sister lived in an old house in Champaign, Illinois, and they both told me that they encountered ghosts several times in that home, and one time they both woke up and saw one standing in their room. So far, I've never seen a ghost, but I'm convinced that they do exist. I've worked as a registered nurse at Henry Male Hospital for many years. There are so many reportings there that I'm not sure I can list them all, but here are a few. The TCU, Transitional Care Unit, is probably the most haunted unit. It serves patients who are not acutely ill, but are also not quite well enough to return home, so consequently, a lot of our elderly patients have spent a great deal of time there, including one that never quite made it home and died on the unit. There have been reports of a walker moving by itself down the hall at night. One room in particular, don't know the number as I didn't work there regularly, has a reputation for the call light repeatedly going off at night when it is empty of patients. So much so that the engineering has refused to come fix the bell when the nurses plead to have it silenced. I only worked there one night and had a heavy fire door slowly swing open in front of me and another nurse, as if someone was going into the room. No windows or doors were open as they were bolted shut, and the door is extremely heavy. The other nurse, terrified, screamed at me, "Close the door, close the door." That same night, I had a female patient who had been in her room for a few months and said she felt like she was going batty and that she was so thankful for her TV. Shortly after, it went to static, and I couldn't turn it off with the remote, nor by pushing the power on and off button on the set itself, and finally had to get a chair to flat out pull out the cord from the outlet that was situated near the ceiling. One night, one of the nurses was working a very late shift at night, and she went to go grab a mop after she spilled her drink all over the lobby floor. She went down to the storage area where she knew nobody was there at the time. As she opened the door to the storage closet, in the darkness, she swore she saw what looked to be the face of an elderly woman from the other side of the room, and two glowing eyes, barely lit. It was all just bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. She immediately turned on the light and ran all the way back. She refused to go down there the rest of her time working there, and even change careers. It was that devastating to her. On the medical surgical unit too, there are ghosts up and down the whole hallway. The end opposite the nurse's station is especially bad. Rooms 148, 146, and 142 are the worst. Oftentimes, patients who are dying are put in these rooms, and shortly before they do die, patients often report seeing a little blonde girl in their room at night. They either ask the nurses to get her out, or at the very least, ask who she is. I had an aide one night open up a utility locker at the same end and saw the girl. She was crouched behind a walker, scared, looking up at her. Sometimes machines won't work in those rooms. Even if you trade them in several times from the supply department with different ones, they suddenly will start working again. Myself and another nurse witnessed shadow people at the same time walk past the nurse's station window while the computers and lights dimmed simultaneously. He saw the same night one shadow person standing in a doorway, just staring at him. He looked up and asked yes, thinking it was a nurse aide willing to ask him a question, only to realize it wasn't an aide. Aides have seen patients that weren't there earlier in the evening, suddenly lying in a bed, and thinking it was a new admission, brought the vital signs machine back in to take their vitals, only to have the patient gone, and the bed still made. Med-Surg 1 is next to Med-Surg 2, and though it isn't as bad as 2, I've had a patient complain that she felt little kids poking at her and pulling her gown all evening. Med-Surg 1 was a pediatric unit for 1 year when the hospital was first built, but was shut down as it wasn't financially sustainable. The elevators near the cafeteria that lead down to the morgue are just plain creepy at night. I've known people that have had them slam open and shut closed several times before finally shutting and going down to the morgue. I personally would have had them open for me almost 100% of the time if I was pushing a gurney and didn't have a free hand to hit the button, saying thanks to stay on whatever's good side. Besides, it is kinda nice, except for the creepy part. These are only a few of the stories off the top of my head. I myself have only worked on a few of the units, so I'm sure there are many more. I made a dark joke one day to one of the old-time doctors that the hospital was built in an old Indian burial ground, as it has so much activity there. And he responded that indeed it is. Who knows if he is right, but all of Santa Clarita has had Indian tribes situated throughout the valley for thousands of years. In fact, we were one of the main trading hubs, if not the main trading hub, from tribes spanning down into Mexico, all the way up to Canada. I can't validate the Indian burial ground part, but the stories I related to you here, I either experienced myself or spoke with the Asian person firsthand, who had just experienced something themselves, except for TCU, but there again, I used first-hand accounts. I grew up in the great state of Utah. As many know, this state has a rich and glorified history of Native Americans who have lived on the North American soil for generations. I'm going to tell you about my experiences with a ghostly apparition, a series of unusual chants I heard while camping at the famous Uneta National Forest, and even a ghost dog. The climate of Utah is more diverse than you would think. We have areas of lush vegetation, forests, and other greener parts of the state in the north, and in the south, we have dry, barren deserts. This first story is about what my grandfather witnessed when he was driving late at night on the road. This was in St. George, Utah. My grandfather was always a very straight-laced person, never drank, never smoked, always got enough sleep, and had a good head on his shoulders. The reason why I'm mentioning this is to explain what he saw that night. He was driving late at night, where there were barely any cars on the road. In fact, it seemed like he was the only one driving on this road. It was pitch black, and the only visibility he had was from his headlights that shine across the road. He had been driving on the same road for about 15 minutes, a road that was completely isolated in the middle of nowhere. Out of nowhere, he saw saw what looked to be a Native American man standing in the middle of the road from the distance. He slowed down immediately after he saw this, fearing he would hit the man. As he got closer, the Native American man disappeared. Now, he knew it wasn't his imagination. The man looked real to him, at least from afar. His mind wasn't playing tricks on him, and he swore to this day he wasn't tired. He knew what he saw. My grandfather was so floored by the whole event, he had to pause for a second and pull off to the side of the road. Where he stopped was where he saw the man. There was absolutely nothing and no one there. No homes in the area, just desert and a long winding road at night. There was no way he could explain it. This was also in the 1960s, and St. George was way smaller than it is now, a population around 5,000. My grandpa's still alive, in his 90s, and he hasn't given up on the authenticity of his story. He swears he saw a real ghost, and I'm convinced he will take his story to his grave. As for my experience, my family went camping in the Uinta National Forest, where we set up a tent deep in the woods. I remember it was a fantastic time, just me, my dad, and my brother. We heard nothing but the sounds of nature, and were truly enjoying our time alone from civilization. It was getting later in the night, and so we set up a campfire. It might have been around 11 p.m. at night, when my brother, my dad, and I all heard what sounded like a ghostly chant, almost sounding like a group of Native Americans. It sounded almost as if the chants were as low as gorillas chanting to us, which was unusual, because gorillas definitely don't live in Utah, and I couldn't think of an animal that could make such a deep voice. And not only that, but multiple voices chanting at once. What made it so eerie was that it wasn't frantic. The chants had a peacefulness to it. But of course, we were all freaked out. It was definitely not a comforting chant, but it wasn't boisterous. So anyway, my dad told me and my brother to get into the tent to sleep at night, because my dad was genuinely concerned that maybe there were dangerous people out there trying to scare us. The chants only lasted for about a minute, and it eventually went dead silent, and we never heard it again. I think my dad must have waited outside the tent with a campfire for an hour or two, just to make sure everything was okay. He eventually went back into the tent himself. However, that night of bizarre events were far from being over. As we were sleeping, my dad said that he was awakened by the sound of rustling leaves. He woke up and noticed from the inside of his tent a shadow on the other side, as in when you are in a tent and you see someone or something shadow move by. He immediately jumped out of the tent to investigate, but there was nobody there. He thought nothing of it, and then went back to bed. On the third night after camping, we went to bed as usual, and this time, I experienced the same occurrence. Instead of it being a shadow of what my dad thought was a person, it seemed to be of a creature. My guess was a dog, because the shadow shape looked to be of that. It could have been a bear, because the shadow was small from seeing it move from inside of the tent. I immediately woke my dad up, and he went out, and again, nothing. Not sure what to make of all these events, but I'm certain there's more than meets the eye. I had a strange thing happen to me once when I was in the Philippines visiting family. The home I stayed in was part of a group of 3 homes around a central courtyard and a shared restroom and shower facility with the other 2 houses. My family showed me around the place the day I arrived, and then told me to be careful when going outside at night, because there was a ghost that haunted the area. My reaction, of course, was yeah, right, because I just knew they were messing with me. My third night there, I wasn't feeling well, and needed to go to the restroom a lot more than usual. Don't drink the water in the Philippines, by the way. So I ended up going out to the restroom facility late at night. The restroom facility was on the far side of the courtyard from the house I was staying in, and around the side of one of the other houses. And it was very dark, because the lights were out in all of the houses, and the nearest street light was pretty far away. I was on my way back from the restroom, and just as I walked into the courtyard, what felt like a force grabbed me from behind. It was such an odd feeling, like a major resistance pushing me back, almost like going against gravity. To clarify, I don't mean literally. It was just an overwhelming pressure, but I could feel the energy around me so strongly, it's hard to explain exactly. I ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction to an empty field that bordered the courtyard, because something was almost pulling me in that direction, like there were hands on my body. I say something because it felt like a force grabbing me on my arms. This force seemed to disappear when I got closer to the field. I shifted my body around, and all of a sudden, I saw this solid black human shape from a few feet away, not moving, just a black mass silhouette that I could identify as a human, if that makes sense. I took off running towards the home and looking over my shoulder again, and the black shadow was gone. I burst into the home, and apparently I screamed. I don't remember even doing it, but I'm not surprised, and I'm not ashamed, because people were coming out of their bedrooms to see what was going on. I told everyone what happened, and they all took it in stride. One cousin even said, "Oh yeah, that happens." I was really freaked out, and didn't sleep the rest of that night, and I didn't go out at night alone. The rest of the time I was there. I did some reading and asked some questions since then, and the answer I got most often was that I was an evil spirit. From what I've read and been told, these are paranormal entities that are angry, evil, and seek to harm people. Sometimes they used to be human, but others were never human. When I asked what they were if they weren't human, I hear the word demon tossed around quite often. Regardless, there are many stories similar to mine where a black shadow or human shape has grabbed a person, and I just wanted to tell you about my experience. Maybe someone else has had this kind of experience as well. I grew up in a hip stone-roof farmhouse that used to belong to my grandparents. We lived in a German-American neighborhood, and many farmhouses had a quaint old country sensibility, with the main living space a flight of stairs up from the entrance. Like many older homes, ours was large in size, but broken up into small rooms. One such room was my grandmother's old pantry, just off the kitchen. My parents had turned half of it into a small home office, with a desk for the telephone, back in the day of one telephone per household, next to a window that looked out into our backyard. When I was very small, I used to enjoy looking out of our windows at night, making wishes on stars, watching sparkling waves of snow fall through the glow of our yard light, waiting for my dad to come in from his evening milking chores in the barn, occasionally finding surprises, like the summer evening that a huge green Luna moth came to rest on the window of the door. This small, close telephone room frightened me, but I enjoyed the backyard evening view, so I'd bravely venture into the room, crawl up into the chair next to the window, and look outside. One evening, I had a desire to look out the telephone room window. As usual, I was somewhat apprehensive about entering the little room, but my curiosity overcame my anxiety. I took a deep breath and prepared to step over the threshold from the warm light of the kitchen into the darkness. As I did, I looked into the window, and there I saw, staring right back at me, the wizened face of an old man hovering in midair. He was partially bald and had a long handlebar mustache, and he had a furious, even hateful expression. I remember screaming in terror and running outside into the arms of my perplexed mother, crying that a scary old man was floating outside. I remember my mother wondering if I'd seen a frightening program on television and had let my imagination run away with me. I was understandably afraid to venture into that room for a while. The fear and the memory of that night faded away. To the extent that I remembered my experience at all, I tended to explain it in terms of a vivid imagination, and I never had another experience like that in that room. Many years later, when I was a teen, I was sitting at the dinner table with my parents as they were reminiscing about their childhoods, their earliest memories. My father said that one of his earliest memories was of his father's original home, a small wooden home that once stood a short distance away from our farmhouse. He said that he remembered his grandfather dying and being laid out in the parlor of that little home, as was a common occurrence in that rural neighborhood, even in the 20s. "What do you remember about your grandfather?" my mother asked. "He was an old man, mean and strict. We kids were afraid of him. He didn't have a lot of hair, but he did have one of those old-fashioned handlebar mustaches," Dad replied. I felt the hair rise in the back of my neck as I suddenly remembered that vision of my early childhood. My name is Lena, and I'm from Malta. I was looking at your site because I have a ghost story I wanted to share with you. About 8 years ago, I was living with my ex-boyfriend, who had recently changed the house at the time. The home was about 50 years old, and as we were fast asleep, maybe it was between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, I began to slightly wake up, because although I was not fully awake in my head, I was hearing some noises like I had a metal bucket in my yard, which was near the bedroom, like someone was dragging it. Then the wardrobe doors began like someone was shutting and opening them. The wardrobe was by the wall on the side where I was sleeping. I want to remind you that by then, I was still not fully awake. And then I could hear near my ear like people talking. Remember, I was half awake until all of a sudden, I was fully awake, and at the end of the bed, I saw 2 figures of 2 men, and although it was dark in the room, I saw them clearly. When I saw this, I was in awe, and I rose on my ankles, and these 2 figures, as I already told you, were of 2 men. One was young, and the other was older, and they were wearing white robes, and on their heads they had these white turbans, and they had no feet. They half turned and looked at me, and then they went forward like in a slow motion, and began to fade, until they vanished through the wall. I was not frightened at all. I swear that I was fully awake when I saw them, and in the morning, I told my ex-boyfriend, who did not see nothing, because only me they had woken up, and he didn't believe me, but I know for sure that it happened. To this day, I don't know who they were. Excuse me for my poor English. Throughout the years, I've had many experiences with things I've never been able to explain. I'll share some of them here. This is the first one I have a memory of. When I was very small, about 5 years old, we lived with my grandmother while our house was being built. I always felt warm and protected in that home. I never was afraid. Even though my room was at the top of very narrow stairs, and was under the eaves of the attic. I never feared anything in that room. One night, there was a terrible thunderstorm, and I remember dreaming that there was a fire under my parents' bed. I woke up screaming and ran into their room. I kept telling my father that there was a fire under the bed. They did their best to explain that it was only a nightmare and that there was no fire. My father even got out of bed, pulled up the covers, looked under the bed, and promised that there was no fire. I eventually fell back to sleep in the bed with them. An hour or so later, I had the dream again, but the fire was bigger. I started screaming again and woke my parents. This time, however, there was the distinct smell of burning wiring, and indeed, the floorboards under the bed had started to smolder. Luckily for all of us, my father was able to shut off the electricity and stop the fire before it truly started. The only damage was replacing some wiring and a few floorboards. From that point on, though, my parents always listened to me when I had an unusual dream or saw something out of the ordinary. This, though, was the scariest thing my parents witnessed when I just turned 5 years old. We always had the attic stairs open. Apparently, I'd sneaked into our attic for multiple days, and when my parents would catch me playing in the attic, they would ask me why I kept going up there. I would tell them that the old man in the attic was lonely, and he wanted a friend, so I continued to talk to him to keep him company. This clearly startled my parents, and after the fire incident and the dreams that I had, they wanted to get to the bottom of this. They continuously asked me, "Where is this man?" So I would point at the corner in the attic and say, "He's staring at you. He's very mad you ignored him." It was at this point we had a priest come bless the home because it really seemed like a massive negative energy was in the home. I even remember getting a witch psychic to come and investigate, to talk to whoever the man was and get an idea. So we did get a spirit session, and she talked with the spirit. The psychic said she felt a man named Jim was burned to death in this home. With what I said about having dreams of the home burning, it was a man in his early 60s. So we got a spirit box, and the psychic asked if Jim was there. He confirmed and said fire truck 4 or 5 times, then smoke, and I was smoked. The psychic then asked the spirit if it died a bad death, and the spirit box said, "Are you kidding?" She asked again. He said yes. You can't make this stuff up. If you ever played with a spirit box before, you know that spirits communicate with their energy to create statements through radio frequencies and whatnot. What we were able to discern was that there was probably a fire in this home, and that this old man was caught in it. We don't know much aside from that, but this whole experience was spooky. This was back in 2009. I've been a fan of your website for years. I love to read the new and upcoming stories that have been published to your page, as well as the old ones. I used to not really believe in ghosts, like many, until I began encountering them myself. My first experience was when I was right out of high school, and I was working at a bed and breakfast. I sent in that story when it happened. I've since graduated from college, and am now teaching in a quaint town called Woolmarket in Mississippi. The school has been registered as being the oldest in Mississippi, as well as one of the oldest in the United States. In the 1800s, the community was the center of the wool trade, hence the name Woolmarket. Eventually, a school was built in 1910 by the people of the community to help educate their children. It still stands and currently has about 300 students post-Hurricane Katrina. Well, 300 students we can actually see. We are not sure how many attend after hours. The faculty and staff just know it is more than one. This is my second year teaching, and I absolutely love it. The faculty are close, and some of us even stay after school on Wednesdays to do lesson plans together. I was told upon being hired that it isn't the safest place to be after hours, but I didn't realize what they even meant until I started staying late to do lessons. The teacher I worked with started telling me stories of when she used to have a classroom in the main building. She said she used to come real early in the morning to get things set up in her room before the children came, and she would hear children laughing and giggling in the hallway, but she was the only one at school. She said the intercom would come on in her class, and she would hear little children whispering through the system, but when she walked up to the office, it was locked. When I was hired on, the lead teacher told me she never sits at the school alone for the same reasons. Well, doing the lessons at school was just a lot easier for me than dragging all the books home and doing them, so my teacher friend and I began doing them together to make the time go quicker. Usually when everyone had left for the day and we had settled into our seats for a good while, is when we began hearing strange noises. The door to the main building would open and shut by itself, and we knew no one was there. We would hear little children giggling and running down the hall. The intercom would come on in different classrooms down the hall, and we could hear a voice that was not familiar. We began hearing what sounded like adult voices telling students to be quiet in the hallway. Last, but not least, desks would be heard moving and being arranged in different rooms, including the one I taught in. I would walk in, and my desk would be rearranged from the day before. When we would leave the school at night, sometimes after dark, we would see lights flicker on and off in the main building. Soon, things began missing. My lesson plans that I would have placed on my desk to be turned in the following morning would show up in a strange place I know I did not put them, or never be found. Then, when I began taking my printed copy home, my lesson plans on the computer screen would go in a sort of landscape mode, if you will, and would print out where the words would go off the page. There was no way to unlandscape the screen for them to print out correctly. My principal thought it was a joke and told me to fix it, but when I showed her that it wasn't setting on the computer that was causing it, she realized I wasn't kidding. When I started talking to the students and telling them how much I enjoyed them being there, my computer screen formatted my lessons back to its original setting, and I never had that problem again. But as for the giggling, desk moving, and the door slamming, it continues. In fact, while I was teaching last week, I think that one of the students from the past wanted to sit in on my lesson. The door was shut, and it just opened completely by itself, and shut by itself, and a piece of paper flew out on an empty desk up front. The student seemed to feel a chill in the air, and then it was gone. The door opened again, by itself, and closed by itself. My first graders call him Casper, and don't really mind if he pays another visit. My principal says she has encountered similar occurrences in the school, as she too refuses to stay at the school alone. She claims the police officer at night refuses to go by the north wing of the school where my classroom and several others are located, because he sees strange things. Many teachers feel that there are students who died while they were attending Wool Market. Others feel that they are students who attended the school when it was an agricultural school in the 1800s. Whomever they are, they make themselves known to many who attend the school now. We are not afraid of them, but the thought that they exist is kinda creepy. After renting a house in Longview, Washington, my grandmother informed me that their very close friends owned the house before I was born, and that they went there quite often. On occasion, While watching TV in the living room, I would see a man in a brown suit walking down the hallway out of the corner of my eye. When I looked directly that way, he would disappear. On my 12th birthday, my sister-in-law had got me a black balloon with a tombstone on front of it with a saying, "R.I.P. Youth." About a week later, I had just finished barbecuing some steaks and was sitting down to watch the Seahawks play a Monday night football game. With no wind to propel it, the balloon came around the corner from the kitchen into the living room. It stopped halfway into the living room and went back into the hallway towards the bedroom that the man in the brown seemed to be heading to. Halfway down the hall, it stopped, reversed direction, and came back into the living room, where I attacked it with a steak knife. After draining all the helium from it, I threw it away. Our daughter would not sleep in the bedroom that the man appeared to be heading to, saying she felt his presence and was frightened. We changed bedrooms with her, but I had no feeling of his presence there myself. I saw this apparition on numerous occasions, but never felt any dread associated with it. When I described the estimated height and attire of this apparition to my grandmother, she said it sounded like their friend George. I never saw his wife, and according to my grandmother, they were childless. When I was about 13 or 14 years old, I witnessed something that I'll never forget to this day. Every night before I went to bed, my dad always left the bathroom light on so that he wouldn't trip or stumble on anything trying to get to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I knew that the bathroom light was on before I closed my eyes. Usually, if my dad forgot to turn it on, I would do it myself. The light from the bathroom always shined directly into my room, and I would have my door cracked open so that the light would not be directly in my face. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but all I know is that every light in the house is off, including the bathroom, and my door was open all the way. I was lying on my side, looking towards the door, and that's when I saw a black figure standing in the doorframe. It looked like it was leaning on the side of the doorframe just looking at me. I could not see the face or what kind of clothes it had on. It was tall and slender. It did look like it was wearing a hat as well. It did not move 1 inch. The house was dark, but this figure was even darker than the room. I could see the shape of the shoulders and the neck, and I knew it was tall because the top of the head was close to the top of the doorway. I was scared, and at first, I wanted to get up and turn the light on. The light switch was next to the figure standing in the doorway, so I thought I'd see if maybe it was my dad or my brother playing a joke on me, and call out their name, but there was no answer. I knew that it couldn't have been them, because my dad and my brother are not walking around the house in the dark. They are pretty jumpy when it comes to haunted houses and going into dark rooms. Instantly, I had the uncomfortable and frightened feeling inside of me, and I laid down in my bed, then threw the covers over my head. I began to pray to myself like my mom had taught me. I waited about 10 minutes, then took the blankets off my head. It was gone. I jumped out of bed and ran to turn the light on. Then I looked down the hallway and in the bathroom. I turned on the bathroom light before I went back to my bedroom. The next morning, I asked my dad if he was standing in the doorway last night, and he said no. I also asked my brother if he was there, and he said no. I'm not sure what it was or what it wanted that night, but to this day, I have problems sleeping with all the lights off or going into the dark room to turn a light on. I have many stories from my childhood encounters with the supernatural, which I might share at a later date, but for now, I would like to tell you of my current home and the spirit which resides in it. The home used to belong to an older couple who, as I've been told by neighbors, were pretty much forgotten about by their own grown-up children. They had both passed away of old age, and of course, the home and almost all of their belongings went up for sale. My husband purchased the home, and we moved in. Since the birth of our children, now 6 and 4, the kids and I have come to find out there is another person living in the home as well. It started when I was pregnant with my son. I would awake at night to find my daughter sitting up in bed, playing with a toy that I knew she didn't have in her crib when I laid her down for the night. I assumed my husband was giving her these toys off the floor when he would get home from working second shift. I asked him about it, and he assured me he was not even walking into her room, let alone giving her toys in the middle of the night. I started to watch her during her naps, just to see if she had found a way to climb out of her crib and back in again. I never once saw her climb out, or into it, for that matter. When my son was born, we moved him into the room with our daughter. It's only a 2-bedroom home. As my son grew older, we heard very little from our resident ghost. One night, I had just gone to bed and was just about to drift off when I saw someone dart down the hall to my children's room. I got up and peeked in, but there was no one there and all was quiet, so I went back to bed. I laid back down under the covers and closed my eyes, and right next to my ear, I hear an older woman's voice rather loudly say, "I can't breathe." For some reason, I thought of my son in that moment. Well, I jumped to my feet and ran to the kids' room. My son was breathing, but it was very struggled. I called my neighbor to come sit with my daughter and called my husband at work while en route to the emergency room. It turns out that my son had allergies to eggs, which I had never realized, and I had made omelets that evening for dinner. Since then, the visits to my kids are almost nightly. They love to hear me tell stories about the ghost we have come to call Granny Ghost. When they go to bed at night, they say their prayers, and thought prayers. They ask for Granny Ghost to watch over them and keep them safe always. I must admit, I hope she stays around too. My son may not be here today if it wasn't for her. She is welcome to stay with us as long as she likes. That is my story. Thank you for taking the time to read it. I would like to submit the following, based on personal experience, since we, or myself, have lived in these homes. Palmer, Massachusetts. This home was owned by my husband since its construction in 1927. Deceased family members often made their presence known by pushing us, whispering, talking out loud, and showing themselves in partial form. Bagpipe music was heard in the basement of the home. My husband's deceased grandfather. Tiny shadows dancing on a bedroom ceiling were witnessed. A dark shape flying through the basement on one occasion was seen by my husband. And in Oxford, Massachusetts, I owned this home with my late ex-husband. He loved the house so much that he swore he would never sell it during his lifetime. Soon after his death in 2001, his voice had been heard by a neighbor calling out to her in a happy greeting. A fleeting glimpse of him had been seen through the kitchen and living room windows. The house was sold at an auction in 2002. No word on whether or not a spirit has been seen since. Dudley, Massachusetts. Built in 1839, this home has been the scene of many hauntings, witnessed by both the former owner of the home and myself, as I had rented the house in 1983 for 6 months. A baby who had died in an unused upstairs bedroom could often be heard crying. The baby would pull blankets off of a bed in another upstairs room. The creaking sounds of a rocking chair could be heard from the dead baby's bedroom. The images of four men could be seen in the basement. Voices were often heard from the basement. A white image was once seen, streaking from the kitchen into the bathroom wall, which was formerly a pantry. Many cold spots were felt even in the hottest summer months. Some people who entered the home usually felt a feeling of uneasiness, like they shouldn't be there. Footsteps were often heard, the sound of a dragging foot. I later learned this was the ghost of a former owner who had suffered a leg injury during the Civil War. The home was sold in the summer of 1983 to owners who claimed they've never experienced any hauntings, but the house mysteriously went up for sale months after they had purchased it. Springfield, Massachusetts. My husband lived in this opulent home as a child in the 1960s. The entire family witnessed spirits of a soldier who had lived in the home before dying during the war. Fatal wounds could be seen on his body when he thought nobody was looking at him, but if someone caught sight of him and gave him their attention, the bloody wounds would disappear. Other sightings included a former groundskeeper, a small bright dancing light that may have been the spirit of a dead infant, and the ominous form of an elderly woman who would glare at living family members. A room on the unused third floor of the home that held the remains of a wooden bed, and iron rings into the post of the bed, possibly keeping a hidden family member who had been insane or mentally disturbed. My husband's family members described disturbing feelings if they entered this room, as if a satanic spirit dwelled there. After my husband's family moved from the home burned to the ground. A chain-link fence was constructed around the vacant house lot, and nothing was rebuilt in its place as of 2002. I actually just remembered a story. I guess I blocked it out because it scared me, and it was so long ago, and I've added a couple of legends from around here. When I was in middle school, I would stay with my friend a lot. She was all into ghosts, witchcraft, and all that. She lived in the country, way out. One night she told me a story about an old house up in the mountains, that a family used to live there. And one day, their children, boy and girl, were left unattended. The girl had an apple and a sharp knife, so she could cut it. They began running around, and the little girl flipped over the couch, and well, you can come to the conclusion it wasn't good. She fell on a knife and bled to death on the couch. My friend told me the couch was up there still, and what she had experienced on trips up there. Well, being that it was so late there was no way I was walking up a dirt road on a mountain up to a haunted house. So the next day we started walking up there. We passed an old barn that was just spooky. You know how you can just look at a house or structure and get a bad feeling from it? So we continued up to the house, but we never made it in. As soon as the house came into view, I saw something in the upstairs window. I just brushed it off though, because I never experienced anything. We got up to the porch and could hear children laughing, and as soon as you got to the door, the laughter stopped, and a little girl's voice said, "Mommy." After that, I took the hint and took off running, leaving my friend behind. Well, it also had been raining earlier that day, so needless to say, the road was muddy, but you can bet I was running so fast that I slid on my side most of the way back down the road. So even though I'm interested in hauntings and historical sites, I will never go again unless I'm with a group. Out of that experience, all I got was a muddy side and sore leg, and scared half to death. I guess the little girl was wondering if it was her mother returning home, since she never saw her mother again after the accident. Another time I was at my cousin's sleepover birthday party, which he had in their basement apartment. So being like she is, she had a Ouija board. I know that Ouija boards are really only games, but this is what happened. I wouldn't play with it. Surprised? I think not. Anyway, I was sitting on the couch watching a few others play with it. There was a remote on the counter on the other side of the room, and all of a sudden, it was like someone had just pushed it off the counter in a range because it went flying all the way across the room. No one was near it at all. So later, when we were all trying to get sleep, we had about 3 portable heaters because we were in the basement. Even with the heaters on full blast and all of us girls in the room, the more people, more body heat, warmer room. The room was ice cold. So needless to say, I didn't get any sleep because it was too cold for comfort. There are only a couple of haunted places around here. There's a tunnel to nowhere. When the construction workers were working on it, it collapsed and killed many. If you go at night, and you have the nerve to go into the tunnel, pitch black, can't even see your hand in front of you. As you go deeper into the tunnel, if you have a flashlight, count on it going out, and also count on your breathing getting harder too, as you go further. Sure, there are explanations, but this is the story behind it that makes you want to believe it's something else. Then, there's Helen's Bridge. I'm not sure of the true story behind Helen, but all the ones that I've heard can be summed up like this. Something happened to Helen's baby. She jumped off the unfinished bridge to her sad ending. If you venture onto the bridge, which is closed to the public now, you have to walk quite a way. If you walk towards the edge of the bridge and say, "Helen, I got your baby," she appears and tries to harm you if you're dumb enough to stick around. Another thing I experienced really did give me the creeps. Me and a bunch of friends were just out for a ride. They told me about the cemetery that is haunted. If you go through it at night, your car supposedly turns around and cuts off. Me being the chicken I am, I said forget that. Well, they tricked me. They took me to the cemetery another way. As soon as I realized it was a cemetery, I started freaking out and put the car into reverse before I ventured further into the cemetery. Even though I put the car in reverse, when I pushed on the gas, I wouldn't move. It had been put into neutral. So I tried again. Stepped on the gas, went forward, then put into drive. Well then, I tried once more, and it went right back into neutral. No one was pushing the gear shift. None of them even know how to drive a stick. So finally, and luckily, because by this time I was pretty freaked, it stayed in reverse, and I went home and stayed shook up about it for most of the night. Even though I didn't see anything, something was trying to force me to enter. My name is Joe, and this is my most recent encounter. At least I feel it is an encounter. I'm 33, have a very open mind to these such things, and do try to look at both sides of the story before I go telling my family. I also consider myself to be on the sensitive side of those feelings, as in being watched, hairs standing up, those types of feelings. It was about 2 years ago. My ex-girlfriend and I just rented a new place in Malden, Massachusetts. It was very nice and not too old looking. 2 floors and a done-over attic with 2 bedrooms up there. There was a very nicely done master bedroom directly under one of the rooms. That room had a storage space not finished. The creepy event started on the night that our new furniture was delivered. I was meeting the delivery guys. I received the new goods and proceeded to start putting together the dining room table and was alone that night. Suddenly, and I do stress suddenly, I got this eerie feeling I was being watched. A feeling that was full of dread and despair. It was ridiculously unnerving. I did have the radio on, so it wasn't dead silent, but that didn't matter. I tried to shake it off by singing, just so I could get my mind off of that feeling, trying to comfort myself by saying that it's just because you're in a different place. You haven't got comfortable in your new surroundings yet. It wasn't working. Those feelings were getting stronger. Now, mind you, I'm putting this table together in the living room, and that feeling was coming from behind me, from on the stairs. It's as if someone sits on the stairs and pokes their head through the dowels, sort of like they're in jail. As hard as it was, that feeling wasn't going away. So what did I do? I got up off my knees, looked at my watch, and repeatedly told myself, it's getting late. I said that's enough for tonight, trying to kid myself, and left pretty quickly. I didn't say anything to my girlfriend about this since I just thought it was me. So I'm a night owl, and I love watching the TV late into the night. My girlfriend is dead asleep and is next to me in bed. It's around 1:30 a.m. when I start hearing a banging. Not banging like a pounding, but a banging, like stomping noises. These sounds were coming from my daughter's room above us, and she was staying at her grandmother's house that night. I mute the TV and cock my head to focus my hearing, and then it stops. I quickly dismiss it and then unmute the TV. No sooner I do that, that stomping comes back again. Now I'm getting a little nervous, because in the other room up there is her son. He's 5 and fell asleep hours ago. I shut the TV off, put a pillow over my head, and go to sleep, all the while wondering what the heck that was. But it did stop, and nothing else happened that night. Now mind you, this was only a couple span of days, one weeknight. And oh, by the way, we had a mini chihuahua. I was going in the basement to do laundry and the basement wasn't finished, but it was still nice and had small box windows at about the outside grass level, and the dog was following me. At about the time I got to the 3rd step down, I noticed he was still at the threshold of the entranceway refusing to come down. I called and I said, "Come on." He whined and fled back upstairs. I started to do the laundry, and it starts again. Hairs on my neck stand straight up. Goosebumps start appearing on my arms, and the feeling of not being alone floods my body. My fight or flight alarms are going off, and my nerves are starting to get shaky at best. It's not like it felt like a presence was right behind me. It was more towards the other side of the room, as if something was just hanging around. Being curious, I finished putting the laundry in the washing machine and started to go upstairs. I then start getting a sense of relief. Now this could be my own mind playing tricks on me. But as I got to the top step, I felt it again. But this time, it was like it was watching me from the bottom step, just looking up at me as I left. When I got through the door, I felt fine, and nothing really else happened the rest of the night. Up until now, this whole experience was a little unsettling, but nothing major. One night, however, at about 2 or so in the morning, I was playing a computer game. My ex was asleep once again. The computer room was small, about 6 by 6 feet, and it had a doorway, but no door. The computer faces the back wall, so when you sit by the computer, your back is to the very short hallway and stairs. So if you turn around, you can see both very easily. Anyway, I'm playing and feeling comfortable when all of a sudden, the stairs creak. I thought it was just the stairs being stairs, making settling noises and the like, and then again I hear one more creak. Now, the daughter, and she was home this time, was known for trying to sneak down the stairs at night and watch TV. This second time I thought it was her and I turned around, but no one was there. You hear one creak, you can easily dismiss it, but 2? That's when the nervous thoughts start to creep in. Suddenly, they stop. No more creaks as I started to relax and continue to play. All of a sudden the room, even though small, had an open air about it. So if you sit at the computer, you could just feel that there was no door, and hence open. I felt as if there was someone standing in the doorway, and making me feel closed in, casually standing there, and watching me. I could feel eyes upon me. I didn't dare myself to turn around, so I look in the moment. Nothing. The thing was, it must have gotten closer, because very quickly, the hair stood up again. I started getting chills, and I felt a cold and tingling sensation. I then felt as if there was slight pressure on my right shoulder, as if a hand was being placed on it. Very subtle and slight coldness. It felt very much like someone was behind me and looking over my shoulder. This freaked me out so much that I shut the game down very quickly and went to bed, like a 5-year-old who's afraid of thunderstorms. The next day, I decided it was time to say something to my girlfriend. I told her what happened, and she looked at me like I had 10 heads, but still had the look of belief and disbelief. I asked her if she's ever felt any of these feelings that I've had, and her response was no. We went outside to have a cigarette, and the landlord, Dave, pulls into the driveway. We give him a cheery hi and she blurts it out. Joe thinks we have ghosts. I gave her a look of disgust and he starts in, laughs a little, jokes with me, and says, "So we do, huh?" I tell him about what's been happening to me, and I asked if he's ever felt anything. His response is no. This house is Dave's first rental property, and only the second to live in here, as opposed to the original owners. I asked him if he knows anything that has happened in this home, even the age of it, and he said I don't know. He did say it was kinda dated, but he never specified the exact age of this place. Well, to say the least, I never got to find out any more about what it was, because we broke up, and to this day, I'm still convinced that something is in here. Several years ago, I was planning on moving from the USA to Australia to be with my partner Craig. My partner and I would talk for hours on the web. What else can you do when you're 9,000 miles apart? My daughter, Catherine, who was 7 at the time, would often get in on it too. Her and Greg developed a very loving father-daughter relationship, even though he is her stepdad. One day, no different than any other, Greg and I were chatting. He wanted to talk to Catherine. I yelled for her. She was in another room, and I couldn't see the monitor. She came running and stopped dead inside the doorway. She could not see the monitor, and started wigging out, demanding that Greg shut his bedroom door, which was clearly visible behind him. She wouldn't move from where she was. We tried to coax her, but she wasn't having any of it. Greg got up and closed the bedroom door. Catherine ran into my lap and buried her face into my shoulder, away from the monitor. She wouldn't even look at the monitor. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "He's mean, and I don't want to see him." Completely caught off guard, I asked her who was mean. She answered, "The mean guy in the doorway." I asked her to describe him. She said he was tall, had red hair, blue eyes, and wore a dressy shirt. Deeper voice than Greg's. Oh, and by the way, Greg's voice is already pretty deep enough as it is. I tried to get more information out of her. That was all she had, or what she wanted to tell me anyway. I relayed what she had told me to Greg, and he just didn't get it. Catherine left my lap as fast as she had flown into it, yelled goodbye Greg from the other room. I wondered if she had seen something. I had episodes like that when I was her age, and they've continued. I asked Craig if she had described anyone he might know. He looked shocked for a second, and then asked me to wait. He went into the bedroom and came out a few minutes later with a pick in his hand. He looked at me, held up the pick, and said, "Wonder if this is who she saw." I asked who it was, and he said it was his grandfather Bill, who passed away in '92. It was 2007. Now get this. The pick was exactly the description Catherine had given. He was tall, red-haired, blue-eyed, had a dressy shirt in the pick. I asked Craig how he talked, and he said that Bill was old-school Aussie. His voice was deeper than most, and with the accent, it was even harder for Greg to understand him. I excused myself, and went and told Catherine who we thought it was. As soon as I said the name Bill, she smiled. She said, "I thought that was his name. That was the only thing I could almost understand." She seemed more at ease after learning it was his name. Greg, on the other hand, didn't know what to make of it. Apparently, her and Bill made peace and became friends. When I was leaving for Australia, she told me that she didn't need Bill anymore and wanted him to come over and watch over me and Greg till she got there. Gotta love kids. Fast forward a few years. Since my arrival here in Oz, I've heard a man's voice. Sometimes I can understand him. Other times, it's too deep and garbled for me to get. I ask him to repeat slower, and it gets him a little pissy. He has never told me his name, but I know it is Bill. I have that feeling. But lately, over the last year or so, I've been hearing a lot more voices. It's like being in a crowd where everyone is talking at once. I ask someone to step forward and talk only to me, but it just stays garbled. This is a weekly thing. It has gotten to the point where, when it starts, I simply say, "If you're all going to talk to me at once, then I won't be able to understand any of it." What I was wondering is if anyone else has ever heard this, and if so, what did they do? Might this be more family members who saw that Bill was able to talk to us and want to try themselves? Or might it be something bad? Sometimes, not very often, I get a bad feeling when they start talking. Bill is still with me. I asked him, but he's given me nothing. I lived in Chicago up until I was 18 and had graduated high school. My grandfather lived in the house, and we lived on the first floor in the third flat apartment building we owned next door. We had the basement that was connected to the first floor apartment as well. The basement had 3 main rooms. The front room that led outside held a half bath, a washer, dryer, and 2 storage closets. This is where we kept our bikes and skates and stuff. The center room had 4 storage closets, the water heater, and the furnace. This was the room that held all my dad's and grandpa's tools. The back room that led to our upstairs apartment was where we had the deep freezer, old clothes, camping gears, old toys, etc. The center room was awful. Just looking at it, you felt like you were being stared down. Something was sending very angry energy out from that room. If you were in that room, it was just overwhelming and overpowering. It felt as if something was going to grab you and actually hurt you. None of us were hurt, but it always felt like it could happen at any time. My sister believed it to be female. I believed it to be male. This makes me think that it could have been a demon and was just appearing female to her and male to me. The stairs from the basement led to my brother's room. The stairs and the door were extremely creepy. We always kept it locked and bolted, but that didn't do much. It always seemed like someone was going to come bursting through the doors at any time. In the bedroom I shared with my sister, we have both seen strange things. I've seen a man a few times. He would start at the head of my bed, which happened to be by the door to the bedroom, and walk towards my closet. My closet and my parents' closet shared a wall. From there, he would kind of nod his head and then disappear. I could tell he was wearing overalls, work boots, and had gloves in his back pocket. He was tall, about 6 feet, dark hair, dark eyes. I could see all of this, but I could also see the other side of my room through him. He was kind of a misty gray color. I saw him first when I was 5, then again when I was 8, and the last time when I was 14. When I was 12, I felt a pulling on my blanket. At this time, we didn't have any pets that would roam loose, and there was no way for them to get out or even reach my blanket. I feel my blanket being pulled. I kinda grumble and try to pull it back up, but I can't. So I look at the foot of my bed, and there was a boy sitting there, grinning at me, gripping my blanket. I tell him, "You let go. I'm not scared of you. Go away." And he disappears. I pull my blanket back up and go to sleep. Then we just had weird things happen. Bread would slide across the counter. Things would be moved from one end of the bar to the other. Things would go missing for a few days. These types of things not only happen in our apartment, but in the upper 2 levels that we rented out. I was in Arizona a few years back. I was at the Sonoran Desert Museum outside of Tucson. It is more like a zoo than a museum. It was summer, very few people there, and a pretty warm morning. I was in the very back of the property all by myself, taking photos of the native cactus. I was completely alone and enjoying the beautiful outdoors. I suddenly felt a terrible sense of dread behind me. I turned and looked, and there was an elderly Native American man standing there. He was dressed in all black, long-sleeved black shirt in the middle of the summer. His hair was snow white, and his face was wrinkled. When we made eye contact, I felt like someone tweaked my soul. I started to walk, fast. I wanted to get back to the front of the zoo and be where people were. I was really moving, and every time I looked back, the man was about 6 feet behind me. He never seemed to increase his pace, but kept up with me no matter how fast I walked. He casually started straight ahead and kept walking. I made it up to the front and walked into the gift shop. He stayed with me the whole time. I decided to get the heck out of there. I hurried to the parking lot. All I wanted was to get into the car and get away. He was still behind me. When I reached my car, a coyote was standing by the trunk. I made eye contact with that animal. I can't describe it. It sounds nuts, but that coyote gestured towards the exit with his head. Of course, he didn't speak to me, nor did I hear a voice, but I just knew that the coyote would watch over me while I drove away. As I was about to get into the car, I turned back to look, and the coyote and the man were gone. I never went back. Every time I think of this, I feel as if I escaped something terrible. It's so strange, but it's like the coyote knew me, and I knew him. Thoughts, anyone? I don't take drugs, wasn't drinking, or overheated. I swear this happened. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it did. This happened in the summer, and at the time, my horse was living on an old farm not far from the sea. The farm was from 1925, with the original stables and barn. Anyway, on this day, it was only me and my horse there, and I had him standing outside while I was tacking up, since the weather was nice. Where he stood, he had the back entrance to the stables on the right side, and straight in front was the door to the barn. You had to go through the barn to get out. Everything was fine at first. Then, I got this feeling like I was being watched from inside the stable. I looked inside, thinking that maybe one of the other girls who had their horses there had come. But it was empty. I shrugged it off and continued grooming. Then, I noticed my horse had his attention towards the stables. I walked up to the door and looked inside, but again, there was no one. I got my saddle and stuff and started tacking up, and then my horse suddenly tensed up. He stood completely still, his ears forward, and all his attention on the entrance to the barn. I looked over, thinking it was a cat or something, but what I saw made the hairs on my neck stand up. In the barn stood a tractor. Behind this, I could see a dark figure. It didn't really look like a man. It was more, I don't know, liquid sort of. It stood on the one side of the tractor, partly hidden, and I could swear that it was staring back at us. It moved backward towards the back of the tractor and just vanished. Well, I hurried up with my Sadie, grabbed my helmet, and though I really didn't want to, I walked my horse towards the barn. Let me tell you, it was no easy task getting him to go inside, and when I got him inside, he refused to go anywhere near the tractor and almost ran out the other side, pulling me alongside with him. I'm having some problems with the spirit in my fiance's house again. For the past few months, the house has been dormant, and so we didn't worry much about what was going on in the home. We had one of my fiance's friends move in, and things were fairly calm and peaceful. Her friend, though, began to never stay at the house, and due to some issues, emotions got rather heated between the three of us. 2 days ago, her friend moved back after a fight, and activity has escalated in the home since then. Yesterday, I got an overwhelming sense of fear and dread while at the house, and I had an overwhelming headache come over myself. I began packing up my things and told my fiancée to pack her things because we needed to stay a few days at my house. She became overwhelmingly tired and had a headache, much like mine, and passed out. When she woke up, she wasn't herself, but quickly came back out of it. Then, I went to the bathroom, and when I looked into the mirrors from the corner of my eye, I saw something I couldn't explain. The thing was, though, it looked inhuman and comprised of only bones, I think, and it seemed to be wanting out of the mirror. I ran back, and my fiancée was packing and taking her time out, humming to the tune of an old music box that used to be in her friend's room. She started to have a play fight with me and threw a shirt at me, then casually kicked the door shut. The next thing I know, she screams and I kick the door open. She said I'd been standing in the mirror after I'd left the room. She seemed fine at the moment, and so I just watched over her as she kept packing. She began stalling again though, and I told her we needed to get going or we'd be late for dinner. She then told me that she didn't want to. She liked the house and wanted to stay there. I began to hear voices as well, other than hers in the house, and got drowsy, but kept my head about me. She finally was packed, and I got her to go outside for a brief moment to see if being out of the house would snap her out of the trance. She got rather defensive and ran off and ran under a doorway where there was a crucifix standing above the doorway. When she ran through it, she collapsed and then woke up again, perfectly fine and not remembering about the past 45 minutes, except for bits and pieces, like she had been dreaming. I've been having concerns that she may be channeling spirits by accident in her sleep and such, and this incident definitely confirms my suspicions. I'm psychologically drained from the mental strength it took the two of us to get out of the home. We're going back to the house in about 4 or 5 days, and figure it should be fine. Whatever this entity is, it fed strongly off the negative emotions that had built up in this house. I know at the strength it was yesterday, it would be much hard for me to face it and cleanse the house on my own, so we're leaving the house to settle and calm back down. By then, I feel this entity will have lost most of its power, and it would be the best time to cleanse the home and seal any portals that may have been opened in the home. I'm still a little bit apprehensive though, and if anyone could offer up some help, it would greatly be appreciated. If my fiancée is the target of any danger, I can pull through any fight normally and keep her safe, but I've been so drained, and I don't know if I can handle the cleansing of the home by myself. If anyone could please help, either physically or through even psychological support, it would greatly be appreciated. Hey there, I live in Akron, Ohio. About a year ago, I moved into my ex's house since it was nice, and well, we were in love. I lived there for about 6 months before she broke it off and decided to live in Ireland. I've been heartbroken for a long time, but I do remember some extra stuff that happened in that home. It's on Spicer Street in Akron, Ohio. About a month after I moved in, the first thing I noticed was waking up with her, and every single clock in the house, including the computer clock, wristwatches, etc., would be turned around 40 minutes ahead than what they were supposed to be. This only happened once, and after I arrived at class, she called me to explain how each clock had changed overnight. Later, she told me that the previous tenants believed the house was haunted and refused to move back in. They were both girls, I was told. We began to notice other things too, such as their stuff would get moved if we left the kitchen. The television would turn on and off. Lights would turn on and off if we left the home. Fan would move and not move. TV would turn channels with the remote being on the TV. And certain spots in the house would be unusually cold. She was scared at times, but I typically wasn't. I just thought of it as having a little kid in the home. I wasn't really worried, and I was confident that I'd be able to protect her from that kind of stuff. If you read some of my earlier posts, I see specks a lot, and I guess it gives me some sort of confidence, even if I don't understand them. My thoughts were confirmed, I believe, when I was sitting in the living room with her and thought I spotted a blonde-haired boy's face under her table. It looked a lot like a German kid, but naturally, I blinked and it was gone. There were 2 spots in the house that seemed really weird. The basement was odd, but not too odd, since students in the past used this place for studying. The oddest part in her house was her bedroom closet. I would step at the door and not go in. She refused to even sleep close to it. I was the one who slept closest to it while she slept between me and the wall. I didn't really see anything from it, but it did feel really weird, and it didn't feel like the kid. It was something else. Also, that closet was connected to the attic, which neither of us ventured into. After I saw the kid, I felt some sort of attachment to it. I remember she used to complain that sometimes my eyes would go completely black in the house. I'd usually counter it with me complaining about staring at me as she slept as if I woke up around 5 in the morning, but we wouldn't argue about it. It was just weird. When we broke up, or rather, when she broke up with me, I'll admit it, her away messages often wrote how she was scared and didn't want to hear any noises. So I guess the activity in the home increased when I left. Again, not sure why. So, I want to find out more about the home, but I don't know where to start. I've been lurking on here for about 2 years now, and well, I decided to finally post about my experiences with ghosts. Really only one ghost. It happened to be here in my house for a number of years throughout the 70s. The house had been built in 1970 on an old lot where an old man had lived on a shack and had died. Now, the spirit that had stayed on the property was one of a child, though. Maybe the old man had a kid and it died. Who knows? Anyway, all sorts of stuff that one would imagine a child would do happened. You know, things would get lost, stuff would move from one place to another, vases and sculptures would be on their place on tables, and when the family would come back, the sad items would be in pieces, smashed against a wall about 3 or 4 feet away. Sometimes, of course, you couldn't get into the house because the screen door would be locked and nobody was in the house at the time. Just imagine a door with a simple hook going into the circle slot. Now, over the years, I've tried to get that hook to slip over into the lock, you know, to see if it could happen by accident. It could never be an accident. If one wants to lock that screen door, you intentionally do it. Feelings of being watched and feeling the weight of someone or something next to you in the bed. My grandma would tell me that I would go off in the house in my walker circa 1981 or 82, and I would travel all the way from the kitchen to the living room to the hallway. Now, when one enters the hallway, even in the daytime, if all the doors to the room are shut, it is pitch black. She claimed that I would be in the hallway for a couple of minutes, and then I would come shooting out from the hallway as if my walker was pushed or shoved by something, all the way back to the kitchen and crash into the wall. Now, it would take me a couple of minutes to get all the way to the hallway since I was a toddler, yet it wouldn't even take me a minute to come crashing into the wall of the kitchen. Now, I remember seeing some sort of whitish gray ball floating when I was laying down on the rug one day. This must have been 1982 or 83. I can still see that image in my brain to this day. My grandmother noticed me getting up and looking under the dining room table, and I started to shout, "Get out!" or in my way of talking back then, "Get out!" My grandma started yelling, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" I kept on shouting and punching and kicking at nothing, all the way towards the front doorway. And when I got to the door, I kept kicking the door, and then I stopped. By this time, my grandmother, who was rather slow due to weight, had gotten to the hallway that led to the front door and was asking me what was wrong. She told me that I had said that I didn't want it here, and I told it to get out. I think I had some sort of hold over it, as I was the only child born in the house. My uncle, who was only 12 at the time, had been born in an older house. I think the spirit was attracted by the fresh new life that was now in the home, much like the spirits in poltergeists were attracted to the little girl. You know, they wanted some sort of that life force. I think that was the case with this. I got rid of it before it got too powerful, much later on. What do you think? I've lived in this house for the past 27 years. Nothing out of the ordinary's happened since those early years.
I've always been sensitive to spirits being present. For as long as I can remember, there has always been someone there in the corner of my room at night, or creaking in the walls. My house was built during the Great Depression. My mom, grandfather, and great-grandfather, who built the house, have all lived here. I remember one night, I was 5 or 6, I think, and it was summer. I was in my backyard. It was pretty late, and I looked in the bushes and saw a face. Being the curious little kid that I was, I nudged a little closer. The face was weird looking, almost unhuman, and was a weird tint of green and almost transparent. As I drew closer, it just popped out of the bushes. I screamed and ran to the front porch where my mom, dad, and brother were. I never told anyone about that face. Eventually, that incident was drawn onto my head. I hadn't thought about it, and with other things going on, frankly, I just didn't care. Until one day, my second grade class was on a field trip to the Historical Society. One of the exhibits was of a small bedroom in the 1850s time. I was in the attic kind of bedroom with the ceiling slanted, and I went towards the bed, and for a few seconds, this person was lying on the bed. She looked up at me, and then she was gone. I was so frightened, I just ran out of the room and hid downstairs till my teacher and the rest of the class came down. There would be sightings every now and then, mostly in the basement. I would hear someone hiding behind the water heater and bookshelves and would eventually just refuse to go down there. When my mom asked me about this, I told her there was someone down there. She refused to believe this, and I just stopped trying to convince her. The only time I can say that a spirit just scared the crap out of me was when I was in the 5th grade. I was in the park with my dad and was visiting the memorial. While my dad was doing something, I don't remember what, I went off to one of the stones farther away. I leaned up next to the stone and was reading the description on it. And while I did so, a man came up to me. He looked very frightened. He bent down next to me and asked me something. I think about the weather, and he looked like he wanted to cry or something. I don't know. He kind of looked like when you're dying to ask someone something, but you don't know how to ask them. That's what his face looked like. I remember asking him if he was okay, and he just burst into tears. He said something like I had to help him. I was the only one who could help him. He looked so frantic and desperate that he was scary looking. I didn't know what else to do, so I just ran towards my dad shaking from head to foot. Looking back, I wish I could have helped him. I just didn't know how. I know there are some skeptics out there who'll go around saying it's all in your mind and it's playing tricks on you, or one of my mother's personal favorites, it's just your imagination. But if we let that take over our better judgment, no one is going to help these lost souls, and somebody has to. You just have to be willing to believe. Hi, my name is Christine, and I was a student at Heidelberg College, which is located in Tiffin, Ohio, and far from any other places of civilization. As a freshman and sophomore, I lived in France Hall. France Hall is, and has always been, an all-girls dorm. Another fun fact about Heidelberg College is that it was one of the first colleges to allow women to attend. As a new resident of France Hall, I was told about our most famous ghost, Ellen. There were a few odd experiences. For example, the normal cold spots in the dungeon, aka the basement or laundry room, noises, and whatnot. During my sophomore year, I pledged into one of the oldest societies on campus. It was during my pledging process that I learned about the story of Ellen. Shortly after the Hesperian Society split into 2 new societies in 1913, a Glossian Society and the Palanthean, also known as Hughes and Phils. Ellen wanted to go through the pledging process. FYI, women had to place bids or asking permission to join a Greek organization. If the group does not believe a woman will benefit from the society, she can be rejected. Ellen was rushing 5 and would wear their colors every day before the bidding day. Sadly, Ellen was not invited into the Philampian Society. Greatly upset by this, she went into the attic, wrote and carved fire dye on the walls and rafters. Near the doorway, she hung herself. Today, the door to the attic is locked. I've tried to get in. Normally, Ellen just likes to play around. She has fondly locked me out of my room when I was in the shower a few times, turned on the TV at all hours of the night during exam week, and my favorite, turned the radio to a different station. I've also been in the catacombs, under Founders Hall, and visited the haunted meat room. It wasn't spooky or anything, but I can understand why a lot of the halls are blocked off now. Easy to get lost, and the hooks that used to hang on the meat room are no longer there. Brown Hall is now haunted by a young man who killed himself on the railroad tracks right behind the campus a few years ago. He likes to goof off on the girls' floor of that dorm and watch over some of the students who were close to him before he died. He also likes to play around in the bathroom. Interesting. My boyfriend, we'll call him Steve, works at his family's farm that's been around for 124 years. So basically, it's been in the family for 5 generations. There have been a lot of changes, which is expected when you have a piece of property that's so old, but there are buildings that remain the same. These buildings, along with a creek that runs right by the property, I believe are not haunted, but replay things that happened long ago. Steve has seen these images and explained them to me. For instance, the milk house is an old building that still stands, but is now used as a workshop. At the right moment, you can watch Steve's great-grandfather working in the building. He passed away many years ago. Also, in the old part of the barn, he's seen helping hands or workers from the past walking around. They never even seem to notice that Steve is even there. These encounters seem pleasant, and if you knew they were past relatives, I can understand why you might be glad to see them. But the experience I had was not pleasant, and I was definitely not glad to see it. Back in the 1920s, one of Steve's relatives had a 2-year-old girl. This poor little girl wandered away from the house, fell into the creek by the garden, and drowned. She wasn't discovered until the next morning. Her body had floated downstream. This story is important because it plays a part in my encounter. About a year ago, I decided to take the rowboat out into the creek. I have a little girl, 2 years old at the time, whom I left in the care of Steve since we didn't have a life jacket for her. This was my first time in the boat, and I was excited about seeing Mother Nature since the landscape was beautiful around the area. I must have been on the water for only 15 minutes before I heard a loud splash close to the bank. I looked to my right, but didn't see anything, not even ripples in the water, indicating that something had fallen in. This made me extremely curious, so I decided to row the boat closer to the bank. Now, the bank is about a foot above the water level, and the water is roughly about 3 feet deep. Before I could even grab a hold of the oars, I saw what I thought was my daughter, since she was small and had brown hair, splashing around in the water and swinging her arms desperately back and forth as if trying to hold on to something. What I didn't realize at the time was that there was absolutely no sound of the splashing. Being deathly scared for my daughter's life, I didn't think about it. I jumped into the water and began swimming desperately towards the bank. I can't even begin to explain how I felt. All I can say is that I was more determined than ever to reach her. I remember stopping once my feet could touch the bottom and searching for her, and to my horror, I didn't see her anywhere. The creek was a brown color, and so I couldn't see the bottom. I was diving down and grabbing anything I could find to see if it was her. I was seriously hysterical at this point in time. I kept saying, "No, no, God, please no," and shouting my daughter's name. Now, Steve, along with my daughter, heard me splashing into the water and then heard me calling to my daughter. He could see the empty boat a little ways down the creek and started running to find out what was wrong. Also, Steve's grandmother was in the kitchen, which is located just behind the bush of the bank where I was at, and heard me as well. She too got up and headed towards me to investigate. I remember hearing her asking me what was wrong. To that I just kept repeating that my daughter was in the water and asking where she was. I believe I was on the verge of fainting until I saw Steve holding my daughter on the bank. Then confusion kicked in. I was so thrilled to see my daughter, but at the same time, dumbfounded about it. He helped me onto the bank, and I held my daughter like there was no tomorrow. While I was doing that, Steve's grandmother was explaining to him what she heard and saw. I had them both confused as well. I told him what I saw, and Steve slid into the water and began to look around, but said he didn't see or feel anything. His grandmother was silent while this was going on, but then spoke up with this grief-stricken look on her face. She said, "Oh my, it must have been Harriet." Both Steve and his grandmother hung their heads, but I was still clueless since I had never heard the story before. That's when she explained to me what happened all those years ago. Slowly, it all started to make sense. Why I hadn't seen the ripples in the water, why I didn't hear the splashing, why in seconds it took me to get to her and she had vanished. Since that day, I've never gone near that part of the bank, and I make sure my children do the same. I have a son as well. It's horrifying what I'd seen and went through, and I pray that no one has to go through that. My brother's story, I'll keep short. My brother David is a semi-truck driver. He runs his rounds all week long and comes home for the weekends. As some of you may know, there are times when you're driving long into the night. On one particular night, David was driving down a road, heading back towards the interstate with a buddy of his in his truck. He was making good time, wasn't tired yet, and decided to wait and stop at the next rest area down the interstate. I believe he said it was between 10 and 11 p.m. when they saw her. His buddy saw her first and started screaming, as David would say, like a little girl. When David turned to look at his buddy, his attention went immediately to the passenger side window. There, a woman had somehow clasped onto the outside of the door and was staring at him through the window. He described her as pale white, shoulder-length blonde hair, and dark eyes. He said she kinda glowed, but claimed the full moon could have made her look that way. The woman was only there for a couple of seconds before she disappeared. David's buddy said he had enough fun for one night and crawled into the back of the semi and onto one of the bunks. A few weeks later, during daylight hours, my brother found himself on that same road and stopped at a local truck stop to eat. There were other truck drivers there, and out of the blue he asked, "I know you're all gonna think I'm crazy, but have any of you seen a woman on the side of your truck? Late at night, while you're driving down this road?" This is the story they told him. About 10 years ago, a woman was standing on the side of the road. She was alone and having car trouble late at night. She spotted a semi down the road, heading in her direction. In an attempt to wave him down, she walked down to the middle of the road and started waving her arms. Apparently, the truck driver was so exhausted that he didn't even see her, or so people think. He ran over her and didn't stop, just kept going. To this day, no one has been pressed with charges for the crime. Now they say that any semi that drives down that road at night could be a suspect to the woman. My name's Jody. I'm 20 years old, from Australia, and have been reading the stories on your site for years. I just thought, what the heck, I'll get into one of my own. This isn't that much of a scary story. It just freaked me out a bit. This happened back when I was 17. I was dating this guy. We will call him Steve. One night, me, Steve and my sister, and one of his mates all went out on a double date. It was about 11 when we ended back at Steve's house. Me and my sister decided to bunk down there for the night as I was too tired to drive home. I was the first to turn in as I had work the next day, and the boys and my sister decided to stay out on the back patio for a while. I was in Steve's room, and I must have dozed off, when all of a sudden I woke up, but I couldn't even open my eyes. I tried to open my mouth, but I couldn't. At this point, I was literally crapping myself. I didn't know what to do, so I started to panic. Then, all of a sudden, I started feeling really sick, then had a mental picture of a man in the doorway. I may have just had a bad dream, but I'm almost certain that it was real. I told my sister what had happened on the way home, and she told me that she had the same eerie feeling the second that she walked into that house. Thanks for reading. My name is Virginia East, and I'm now 20 years old and live in Freedom, Indiana. I grew up on the south side of Indianapolis. I mostly lived with my grandmother throughout the first 5 years of my life, but I always lived not too far away from her. My grandmother's house was originally built as a saloon. I don't know what year it was built in, but my guess would have to say close to or about the mid-1900s. I'll start off by telling the story as to why I think her house was haunted. One night, while the house was still a saloon, two men had gotten into an argument upstairs over a woman. The outcome of the argument was one man was murdered. We strongly believe that his spirit had never left that house and that his murderer was a redhead. I'll get to as why I think that later. My first personal experience happened when I was about 9 years old. My younger cousin and I were going into the basement to finish a project that we were painting. As we got halfway down the stairs, we both saw something that appeared to be a man back about 50 years ago by the way he was dressed. We stood still and back up about 2 stairs and watched to see if it was a burglar or if it was actually a ghost. The next thing we saw was a noose hanging from one of the beams in the ceiling and a chair underneath it. The man stepped onto the chair and put the noose around his neck. When he kicked the chair out from underneath him, he disappeared into thin air. My grandmother had several experiences in this house. She had a little dog that she loved to play with rubber bouncy balls. She was walking past the basement door one day to go into the kitchen, and she heard something being dropped down the basement stairs. She opened the door to find a little boy bouncing a little blue rubber ball down the stairs. The young boy looked back at her and disappeared. She went to the bottom of the stairs to retrieve the ball and put it in the cabinet. The next day, she heard something else being dropped down the stairs, but this time, it was a more solid sound. She looked into the cabinet and noticed that the blue ball was gone. Not thinking much of it, since she had several young small grandchildren, she opened the door again to find the same little boy, only this time bouncing a marble down the stairs. My grandfather had passed away in his home sometime in 1997. He died in his and my grandmother's bedroom. When my grandma came home from the hospital, she had went upstairs one night to go to sleep. She had always slept on the right side of the bed. If you look at it from the foot of the bed, she had rolled her head over to the side that my grandfather would sleep on, and she saw an indentation on the pillow. It was an indent of a head, as if someone was lying next to her, but there was no one there. The man that had been killed in the fight when the house was still a saloon, us grandchildren started calling him Turk. I don't know why, but it just seemed to fit. But this is why I believe that the murderer was a redhead. When my mother and aunt were teenagers, they would always sneak into the bathroom to smoke. On several occasions, they couldn't even get the bathroom door open. My mother and aunt are both redheads. On several occasions also, when one of them would go to the bathroom, they would get locked in, and there was not a lock on the outside of the door. One incident, when 2 of my older female cousins and my older brother went up to the attic to get something for our grandma, something strange happened. As they were all making their way down the stairs, my brother was the last in line. My brother is a redhead. He was the only true redhead out of the 3 of them. As he was coming down the stairs, he felt something grab him from his wrist, forbidding him to go any further down the stairs. My cousin that was in front of him turned back to see what was going on, and all she saw was my brother leaning in midair with his right arm being held by something that wasn't there. My cousin tried to pull him free, but to no avail. Finally, he was released, and they never went into the attic again. After my grandmother passed away in 1999, the house went up for sale. Well, it had 3 different buyers, and they all just left it. So, in late 2001, the city decided to tear it down. The house is no longer there, but 2 of my older cousins and my aunt live right across from the street from where the house used to be. We believe that Turk may have traveled over to their house. The reason being was because after Grandma's house was torn down, we started hearing heavy footsteps walking across the hall upstairs and up and down the stairs late at night, and no one goes upstairs. At this point, the upstairs was still blocked off. Thank you for letting me share my experiences, and I hope you really enjoyed this. If I have any more experiences that might show up in the future, I'll let you know so you can all get a taste of Turk again, the paranormal entity that haunted my grandma.
The fireplace. This is the first paranormal experience that I ever had. It took place at my grandma's house, and I was 7 years old. My grandma lived in a suburb of Melbourne called St. Kilda and lived on Crema Street. Many of the houses in St. Kilda were built in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and many were mansions. My grandma's house was a single-story, red-bricked, two-bedroom home that was very modest in comparison to some of the mansions that were built on Crema Street. It was built on a large block of land, and I remember the front and back being overgrown with trees. Sadly, many of these houses have now been torn down to make room for newly built houses and apartment buildings. My grandma's home had 2 bedrooms at the front of the house, and then a long dark hallway which led to the lounge and kitchen area. The laundry and bathroom facilities were located outside, which was not unusual for houses built in this era. The main bedroom, which was my grandma's, had a huge fireplace in it. No central heating back in the day when the houses were built. The house was always cold, mainly due to the fact that it was surrounded by trees. It was a great cool house to be in during the hot summer, but it would get extremely cold in the wintertime. There was a gas heater at the front of the house, which would warm up the lounge and kitchen area, but bedrooms would always stay cold. As my grandma was getting old and suffered from bad asthma, my dad used to worry a lot in the winter that she would get too cold in the wintertime at night in her bedroom. My grandma absolutely refused to use the fireplace as she was scared of having an accident and being burnt or setting the house on fire. Many times when we visit her, I can remember my dad constantly offering to light a small fire in the fireplace, telling my grandma that he would extinguish it before we left, just so she could have a bit of warmth in her room at night. But she flatly refused and would be very adamant that she did not want to ever use the fireplace. I remember it was a Saturday night, and my dad and I had stayed for dinner. I was sitting on the floor in front of the TV, and I was watching The Muppet Show. I must have fallen asleep, and my dad took me to my grandma's room and put me in her bed. He left the door open and switched on a lamp next to the bed. I remember walking up and realizing that I was in my grandma's room, and I was all alone. I hated being alone in her house, and I was really afraid of the long dark hallway and would never venture to the front of the house without someone being with me. I threw back the bed covers and contemplated whether I should call out for my dad to come and get me, or if I should make the bolt down the dark hallway to the safety of my dad and grandma. I put my feet on the floor, deciding I would run down the hallway, and something flickering caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. Standing by the fireplace was a transparent figure of a lady. She was standing side on and seemed to be gazing sadly into the fireplace. She was wearing a nightgown that was long at the back, but the front of the gown seemed much shorter and ragged looking. I screamed like a banshee and tore out of the room down the hallway where my dad met me halfway. Through terrified tears, I told him that there was a lady in a funny nightie in my grandma's room. He went to have a look while my grandma hugged me. She told me not to be afraid and the lady would never hurt me. My dad assumed that I must have had a bad dream, although I insisted it was real. Every time we visited my grandma after this, I would never look into her bedroom. For fear I would see this lady once again. A few years later, my grandma moved as the house was getting too much for her to maintain on her own, and she moved into a smaller flat. While packing and cleaning up, my dad made a joke that at least we would not have to clean out the fireplace, as it had never been used, and it brought back the memory of the night I saw the lady in the strange nightie. I asked my grandma if she remembered, And she said of course she did. She then went on to tell me that she had seen this lady on many occasions over the years and had grown used to seeing her. She believed that she was a past resident of the house that had probably fallen into the fireplace and had burnt herself to death. Hence why her nightgown was shorter and ragged at the front, as it was burnt. My grandma had not mentioned this to me before, as she did not want me to be any more scared than I was when I visited her. This is why she never used a fireplace, as she felt this lady answered and appeared as a warning that accidents can happen, and obviously my grandma took her warning very seriously. My grandma has since passed away, but I will never forget that night I saw this apparition of the lady with the funny nightie. A head in the fireplace. I've lived in the same house all my life. I'm 16 in a few weeks. I'm not an expert on these sorts of things, like you guys seem to be after reading some of your stories, so bear with me, as I'm not very knowledgeable on the subjects of ghosts and demons and those things of that nature. My house is pretty old, about 80 years old, my mom says. My Gramps believes in this sort of thing, but the rest of my family is pretty skeptical, so we will rarely discuss it. The first thing I remember happening to me is when I was about 6. I had chickenpox, and I couldn't sleep because they were so itchy, and my mom let me stay up late. It was about midnight, and I was watching Jurassic Park. I was alone, but my mom was in the next room, if I needed her. We have this big old-fashioned fireplace, but we rarely light it, and it wasn't lit on this night. There was a funny bit in the movie, and I giggled, and I heard a laugh, really quietly, but pretty gruff like a man's. I turned around and saw a man's head in the fireplace. It disappeared quickly, but I was convinced of it. I wasn't frightened at all and just carried on watching the film. See, I have no idea how that head even materialized. I know there was an old lady who previously lived there. She was a librarian. She knew my mom, and my mom had lived on this street all her life. The lady moved out and went to live with her relatives. That was about 25 years ago, so I'm assuming she's not alive, and she was very old when she left. So I'm thinking she might have had a husband, and I guess if I were to explain the fireplace incident, it might have been her husband in the fireplace. I know this is a short story, but there were other events that occurred that I will explain in a different post. So does anybody know what happened or can explain anything about the man in the fireplace? I'm still at a loss for words. I don't know what to say about that. As I said, I'm new to this whole experience and I don't know much about paranormal activity. Thank you though. About 15 years ago, the guy living in my current house died. After about 12 years, we moved in. People say he died from a heart attack, but others say his wife killed him. But I ended up getting the room he died in. Every night, I could hear beating in the chimney in the room, and it would slowly move its way up right above my bed. A week later, I had my friend Megan spend the night to see if we could hear it too. Well, she did. Then I had my sister stay in there to see if she could hear it. About a week later, it was my birthday, and we slept out in the tent. We could hear someone screaming, so we went out to check it out. We didn't see anything outside, so we went inside. We could hear footsteps up the stairs, but we didn't see anybody. But then the door to my room opened. We went in there and we saw a shadow going into the chimney. We were wondering why he would go into the chimney, and people say that his wife killed him and stuffed him in the chimney itself. Every other night, I can hear the doorbell ring, but no one is there. So I'd go up to my bed. Then I could hear the door shut and hear the footsteps go up the stairs and into my room, but this time I didn't see anybody. I've heard rumors that there's a chimney ghost, but also that the body may still be there. Then again, I've never seen a body in the chimney, so I really doubt there would be a body stuffed in the chimney still after all this time. This is pretty creepy, and all the occurrences in the chimney just leave me unsettled.
Hey, Phantom, so basically, if you could leave a like, a comment, and share, I'd really appreciate it for the algorithm. If you got to the end of this video, by the way, please say I like pie, or just say pie in general. And that will prove to me that you got to the end of the video, you enjoyed it, and you want to see more of this. Love you guys, and happy July.